My name is Robert Hughes, and I am 72 years old. This is the story of how my life changed forever on October 12th, 2008. I've been a park ranger at Glacier National Park for almost 5 years, longer than I typically hang around anywhere. The mountains, something about their quiet power, it gets in your blood. I never plan on staying here this long. Most of my adult life has been spent drifting from one place to another, never quite finding somewhere that felt like home. I've worked as a logger in the Pacific Northwest, a ranch hand in Texas, even did a stint as a fisherman up in Alaska. But nothing ever stuck. There was always this restlessness in me, an itch that said it was time to move on. Then I came to Glacier. The first time I saw those jagged peaks piercing the sky, their faces scarred by ancient glaciers, something in me settled. It was like a piece of myself I didn't even know was missing had finally clicked into place. I applied for a ranger position on a whim, figuring I'd give it a season or two before the wanderlust kicked in again. But here I am, 5 years later, still captivated by this place. Most days are routine. I wake up before dawn in my small cabin on the outskirts of the park. The morning air is crisp, carrying the scent of pine and sometimes, if the wind is right, a hint of snow from the higher elevations. I brew a strong pot of coffee, the kind that puts hair on your chest, and watch the sun creep over the mountain tops, painting the sky in breathtaking hues of pink and gold. My days are filled with trail maintenance, making sure the paths are clear and safe for visitors. I chat with tourists, reminding them gently but firmly about park rules. Don't feed the bears, I tell them, my voice gruff but not unkind. It's not good for them, and it's definitely not good for you. Sometimes I have to bite back a chuckle at the wide-eyed looks I get, especially from city folk who've never seen a wild animal bigger than a raccoon. Occasionally, there's the excitement of a lost hiker. Those are the days when adrenaline pumps through my veins, when every skill I've learned over the years is put to the test. There's nothing quite like the relief of finding someone who's been out there alone, scared, and bringing them back to safety. But it's the quiet moments I live for. Those times when I'm out on the trail, miles from the nearest person, surrounded by nothing but wilderness. The air is so clean it almost hurts to breathe. The silence is profound, broken only by the whisper of wind through the trees or the distant cry of an eagle. In those moments, I feel small, insignificant, just another part of this vast, ancient place. And oddly enough, that feeling brings me more peace than anything else in my life ever has. It's a reminder that my problems, my worries, they're all temporary. These mountains have stood for millions of years. They'll be here long after I'm gone. But on October 12th, 2008, everything changed. The peace I'd found in these mountains was shattered, replaced by a horror I still struggle to comprehend. It started like any other day. I woke up, made my coffee, watched the sunrise. The air had a bite to it, hinting at the winter to come. I remember thinking it might be time to start warning hikers about the changing weather conditions. I headed into the ranger station, nodding a greeting to Sarah, the young woman who manned the front desk. She was fresh out of college, full of enthusiasm for the job. Sometimes her eagerness grated on my nerves, but mostly I admired her passion. "Morning, Rob," she said, her voice tense. That immediately put me on alert. Sarah was usually all smiles and cheer. "We've got a situation." I frowned, setting down my thermos. "What kind of situation?" Sarah bit her lip, glancing down at a report on her desk. "Got a call from some hikers up near Lake Josephine. They found an abandoned campsite. Said it looked wrong." "Wrong how?" I asked, my frown deepening. "They said the tent was ransacked, food scattered everywhere. No sign of the campers." Sarah looked up at me, her eyes wide with worry. "They said it felt spooky." I nodded slowly, processing the information. "Could be a bear," I mused. Wouldn't be the first time one's torn up a campsite looking for food. But even as I said it, something didn't sit right. Bears were a common enough problem in the park, but they usually left pretty clear signs. And experienced campers, the kind who'd be out near Lake Josephine this late in the season, knew how to properly store their food to avoid attracting wildlife. "I'll head up there and check it out," I told Sarah. "Radio if anything else comes in about it." She nodded, relief clear on her face. I guess when you're young, it's comforting to pass problems on to someone older, someone you think has all the answers. If only she knew how little I really understood about what was coming. I packed my gear methodically, my mind running through possible scenarios. Maybe it was just an inexperienced group of campers who'd gotten spooked by normal forest sounds and taken off in a hurry. Or it could be a medical emergency, someone had gotten hurt and their companions had rushed them out for help, leaving the campsite in disarray. But a nagging voice in the back of my mind whispered that it was something else. Something worse. As I shouldered my pack and headed out, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was walking into something that would change everything. If I'd known then what I know now, would I have still gone? Or would I have run as far and as fast as I could in the other direction? I'd like to think I'd still go. That the sense of duty that's been a part of me all these years would win out over fear. But the truth is, I just don't know. What I do know is this: as I set out on that crisp October morning, I was still Robert Hughes, park ranger. By the time the sun set, I would be something else entirely. Something that didn't belong in this world of mountains and forests. Something monstrous. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me tell you about that hike, about how the world I knew began to unravel, thread by terrible thread. The trail to Lake Josephine is beautiful, even by Glacier National Park standards. It winds through dense forests of lodgepole pine and western red cedar, occasionally opening up to reveal breathtaking views of the surrounding peaks. On a normal day, I'd take my time, pausing to appreciate the play of light through the leaves or to watch a marmot sunning itself on a rock. But this wasn't a normal day. From the moment I set foot on the trail, something felt off. The forest was too quiet. Now, if you've never spent much time in the wilderness, you might think forests are always quiet. But that's not true at all. A healthy forest is alive with sound, birds calling, squirrels chattering, the rustle of small animals in the underbrush. This silence was different. Oppressive. Like the whole forest was holding its breath, waiting for something terrible to happen. I've been in the woods long enough to trust my instincts, and every one of them was screaming that something was wrong. My hand kept drifting to the pistol holstered at my hip. I've never been much for guns, always figured my brain and my knowledge of the land were better weapons out here. But right then, I was damn glad to have it. The trail twisted and turned through the trees, each bend revealing more of the same eerie quiet. I found myself moving more cautiously, placing each foot with care to avoid snapping twigs or rustling leaves. It was silly, really. I was there to find missing campers, not sneak up on them. But something primordial in me, some ancient survival instinct, demanded stealth. About an hour into the hike, I caught my first concrete sign that something was amiss. There, snagged on a low-hanging branch, was a scrap of blue fabric. It looked like it might have come from a jacket or a sleeping bag. I carefully removed it from the branch, my fingers trembling slightly as I examined it. The edges were frayed, but not in a way that suggested normal wear and tear. It was as if the fabric had been violently torn. And there, barely visible against the blue, were a few dark spots. With a sinking feeling in my gut, I realized it was blood. I bagged the scrap of fabric, my mind racing. This wasn't looking like a simple case of campers spooked by nighttime noises anymore. Something had happened here, something violent. As I continued up the trail, every rustle of leaves, every snapping twig sent a jolt of adrenaline through my system. I found myself jumping at shadows, my imagination populating the silent forest with all manner of threats. Was it a bear attack? A mountain lion? Or, and this thought chilled me to my core, was it something human? In all my years as a ranger, I dealt with my fair share of human threats. Lost hikers turning on each other as panic and dehydration set in. The occasional unstable individual seeking isolation in the wilderness. Even, on rare and terrible occasions, the aftermath of murder. But nothing in my experience had prepared me for what I was about to find. The campsite came into view suddenly. One moment I was surrounded by trees, the next I was standing at the edge of a small clearing. And what I saw there, God, even now, years later, I struggle to describe it. The tent was shredded. Not just torn open, like you might see in a bear attack, but literally ripped to pieces. Strips of nylon were scattered across the clearing like some kind of demented confetti. Sleeping bags, clothes, and camping gear were strewn about as if something had been violently searching through them. Or playing with them. The thought came unbidden, and I felt my skin crawl. There was something deeply wrong about this scene, something that went beyond mere destruction. It was as if whatever had done this had taken a perverse joy in it. And then there was the smell. A sickly sweet odor hung in the air, cloying and thick. It reminded me of rotting meat, but there was something else underneath, something I couldn't quite place. It clung to the back of my throat, making me gag. My hand dropped to my holstered pistol, fingers wrapping around the grip. Part of me wanted to draw it, to have some illusion of protection against whatever had caused this devastation. But I resisted the urge. If this was the work of a bear or some other large predator, the noise of a gunshot might attract it back to the area. I forced myself to approach the remains of the tent, my eyes scanning the ground for any sign of the campers. There were no bodies, which I tried to take as a good sign. Maybe they had managed to escape, to flee whatever had attacked their camp. But as I drew closer, I saw something that shattered that faint hope. There, on the side of a tree at the edge of the clearing, was a splash of dark red. Blood. And next to it, gouged deep into the bark, were claw marks unlike anything I ever seen. They were too large for a bear, too widely spaced. And the pattern was all wrong. It looked almost deliberate. As if whatever had made them had been trying to leave a message. I stumbled back, my breath coming in short, sharp gasps. This was beyond anything in my experience. Beyond anything I'd ever heard of or imagined. That's why I saw the pile. At first, my mind couldn't make sense of what I was seeing. It was just a jumble of cloth and shapes at the far edge of the clearing. But as I forced myself to look closer, to really see what was in front of me, the horror of it hit me like a physical blow. It was mostly clothes, shredded even further than the tent had been. They were stained dark with blood, so much blood. And mixed in with the fabric, gleaming white in the dappled sunlight filtering through the trees, were fragments of bone. My stomach clenched, bile rising in my throat. This wasn't an animal attack. This was something far, far worse. Training took over, pushing through the fog of fear and revulsion. I had to secure the area, look for any signs of survivors, report back to base. My movements felt mechanical, disconnected from the screaming panic in my mind. I started at what remained of the tent, moving outward in a slow spiral. I found more blood spatter, more torn scraps of clothing. Each discovery was like another weight on my chest, making it harder and harder to breathe. And then I saw the hand. It was partially hidden under a fallen branch, and at first, I hoped it was just an oddly shaped piece of wood. But as I drew closer, the truth became horrifyingly clear. It was a human hand. Or at least, it had been. The fingers were wrong. Too long, too thin, ending in black claws that looked like chipped obsidian. The skin was a sickly gray color, mottled with patches of what looked like fur. I fell back, scrambling away from the grotesque appendage. My mind reeled, unable to process what I was seeing. This was impossible. It had to be some kind of prop, a sick joke left by twisted campers. But deep down, I knew it wasn't. The wrongness of it, the alien nature of its form, it was too perfect, too terrible to be fake. As that realization sank in, the world around me seemed to lurch into hyperfocus. Every detail of the forest stood out in sharp relief. The play of light and shadow through the leaves, the rough texture of tree bark, the soft give of the mossy ground under my feet, and the movement at the edge of the clearing. I saw it out of the corner of my eye. A flicker of motion, there and gone so fast I might have thought I imagined it. But the prickling of my skin, the cold sweat breaking out across my brow, told me it was real. Something was out there. Something that didn't belong in this world of sunlight and trees. I turned slowly, my hand inching towards my gun. The forest seemed to hold its breath, the unnatural silence more oppressive than ever. Then I saw it. At the edge of the clearing, half hidden by the shadows of the trees, stood something. It was tall, far taller than any human. Its limbs were impossibly long and thin, jointed in ways that made my mind recoil. And its face. God, its face. Where there should have been features, there was only a smooth, featureless expanse of skin. No eyes, no nose, no mouth. Just a blank canvas of flesh that somehow still managed to convey a sense of hunger, of malevolence. For a moment that stretched into eternity, we stared at each other. Me, frozen in terror. It, utterly still save for a slight swaying, like a tree in a breeze that didn't exist. Then it moved. One moment it was at the edge of the clearing, the next it was on top of me. I didn't see it run or jump. It was just there, its impossible form looming over me, those terrible clawed hands reaching for my face. I screamed. I'm not ashamed to admit it. I screamed like I've never screamed before, a sound of pure animal terror ripped from the depths of my soul. My body reacted on pure instinct. My hand found my gun, pulled it free of its holster. I fired blindly, the sound deafening in the confined space of the clearing. The creature hissed, a long, scratchy sound that seemed to vibrate in my bones. It recoiled, not in pain, but in what seemed almost like surprise. I scrambled backwards, my free hand scrabbling at the forest floor, desperate for any purchase. My chest burned where the creature's claws had raked across it, but there was no blood. Instead, the flesh bubbled and blistered as if I'd been splashed with acid. The creature tilted its head, that blank face somehow radiating curiosity. Then, in a movement that still haunts my nightmares, that smooth expanse of skin split open. Not in a mouth, nothing so mundane or comprehensible. It was as if reality itself tore apart, revealing a void of absolute darkness. And from that void came a sound. Not a roar or a screech, but a vibration that I felt more than heard. It resonated through my body, setting my teeth on edge and making my vision blur. Terror gave me strength I didn't know I possessed. I was on my feet and running before I even realized I'd moved. I crashed through the underbrush, branches whipping in my face, roots threatening to trip me with every step. I had no idea where I was going. All sense of direction, all thought of the trail or my duties as a ranger had been obliterated by blind panic. I just ran, driven by the PR. I just ran, driven by the primal need to escape, to put as much distance between myself and that thing as possible. The forest blurred around me, a green and brown smear punctuated by the sharp sting of branches whipping across my face. My lungs burned, each breath a ragged gasp that didn't seem to bring enough air. But I couldn't stop. I didn't dare. Because it was behind me. I couldn't see it, couldn't hear it over the pounding of my heart and the crash of my clumsy flight through the underbrush. But I could feel it. A presence, vast and hungry, always just a step behind. Time lost all meaning. I could have been running for minutes or hours. My world narrowed to the ground in front of me, the burning in my muscles, and the constant, gnawing fear. Then, miraculously, I burst out onto a familiar trail. For a brief, shining moment, hope flared in my chest. I knew this path. If I could just follow it, I could make it back to the ranger station, to safety. But that hope was short-lived. As I staggered onto the packed earth of the trail, I heard something. A sound that didn't belong in these woods, that shouldn't exist in any sane, rational world. It was laughter. High and cruel, echoing through the trees with a glee that was somehow worse than any roar of rage could have been. I spun around, my legs nearly giving out beneath me. And there it was, standing at the edge of the trees. Its elongated limbs seemed to ripple, as if they couldn't quite decide on a shape. That blank face was turned towards me, and though it had no eyes, I could feel its gaze boring into me. Then I saw the movement behind it. A flash of blonde hair, the bright colors of hiking gear. Another hiker, oblivious to the danger, coming up the trail. Time seemed to slow. I opened my mouth to shout a warning, to tell them to run. But before I could make a sound, the creature moved. It was a blur of motion, too fast for my eyes to track. One moment it was in front of me, the next it was on the trail behind me. I heard a startled cry, cut horribly short. I didn't turn to look. I couldn't. Instead, I did the one thing my training, my duty as a ranger, screamed against. I ran. I plunged back into the trees, away from the trail, away from what I knew was happening behind me. Branches tore at my clothes, roots seemed to reach up to trip me. But I didn't slow down. I couldn't. As I ran, the light began to fade. Whether from the setting sun or gathering storm clouds, I couldn't tell. All I knew was that darkness was falling, and with it, my chances of survival were dwindling. I don't know how long I ran. Time had lost all meaning. But eventually, my body betrayed me. My legs, burning with exhaustion, finally gave out. I collapsed to the forest floor, gasping for breath, my heart feeling like it might burst from my chest. For a long moment, I lay there, waiting for the end. Surely the creature would be upon me at any moment, those terrible claws reaching for me. But nothing came. Slowly, painfully, I pushed myself up. The forest around me was dark now, the trees looming shadows in the gloom. I strained my ears, listening for any sign of pursuit. There was nothing. No rustle of leaves, no crack of breaking branches. Just the oppressive silence that had fallen over the woods since this nightmare began. As my panic began to subside, replaced by a bone-deep exhaustion, I became aware of a new sensation. Pain, sharp and insistent, radiated from my chest where the creature's claws had raked me. With trembling hands, I unbuttoned my shirt. In the fading light, I could just make out the wounds. But they weren't bleeding. Instead, the flesh was red and blistered, as if I'd been splashed with acid. And as I watched, horrified, I saw something moving under my skin. Dark veins, pulsing and writhing, spreading out from the wounds. A wave of nausea washed over me. Whatever that thing was, it had done more than just scratch me. It had infected me with something. I rebuttoned my shirt with shaking hands, trying to push down the rising tide of panic. I needed to think, to plan. I couldn't stay out here in the open. The creature might still be hunting me, and even if it wasn't, the wilderness held plenty of other dangers for someone alone and injured. My eyes fell on a large, hollow tree trunk nearby. It wasn't ideal, but it was shelter of a sort. Gritting my teeth against the pain in my chest, I crawled over to it and squeezed inside. The space was tight, barely big enough for me to curl up in. But it felt safer than being out in the open. I huddled there in the darkness, every rustle of leaves, every hoot of an owl sending a fresh spike of fear through me. As the adrenaline wore off, the full weight of what had happened began to sink in. The destroyed campsite, the remains I'd found. The creature that defied all logic and reason. And now, whatever was happening to me, this infection spreading through my body. I must have dozed off at some point, exhaustion finally overcoming fear. My sleep was fitful, plagued by nightmares of elongated limbs and faceless horrors. Every time I jerked awake, for a terrifying moment, I couldn't remember where I was or what had happened. As the first gray light of dawn began to filter through the trees, I cautiously emerged from my hiding place. My body ached, stiff from being crammed into the small space all night. The wounds on my chest throbbed, a constant reminder of the horror I'd faced. I looked around, trying to get my bearings. In the panic of my flight, I'd lost all sense of direction. I could be miles from any trail, from any hope of rescue. But I couldn't stay here. I needed to find my way back, to warn others about what was out there in the woods. And, though I could barely bring myself to think about it, I needed help. The infection, or whatever it was, that was spreading through me. I had no idea what it might do. With a deep breath, I picked a direction and started walking. Each step was an effort, my body protesting after the ordeal it had been through. But I forced myself to keep moving. As I walked, I tried to piece together what had happened. The creature I'd seen, it defied everything I thought I knew about the natural world. It moved in ways that shouldn't be possible, had abilities that seemed more at home in a horror movie than in reality. And yet, I'd seen it. Felt its claws on my skin. It was real, as impossible as that seemed. More than once, I thought I heard something moving in the woods around me. Each time, I froze, my heart pounding, sure that at any moment I'd see that elongated figure step out from behind a tree. But nothing ever appeared. After what felt like hours of walking, I finally heard a sound that didn't fill me with dread. Water. A stream or river, not too far off. If I could find it, it might lead me back to a trail, or at least give me a better idea of where I was. I altered my course, heading towards the sound. As I got closer, I could see glimpses of sunlight reflecting off water through the trees. Hope, fragile but persistent, began to bloom in my chest. Maybe I would make it out of this after all. Then I stepped into a clearing by the water's edge, and that hope shattered. There, sprawled on the rocky shore, was a body. Or what was left of one. It was the hiker I'd seen on the trail, the one the creature had taken. Her bright hiking clothes were in tatters, stained dark with blood. Her limbs were twisted at impossible angles, bones protruding through torn flesh. But worst of all was her face. Her eyes were gone, leaving dark, empty sockets that seemed to stare accusingly at me. And her mouth, it was stretched wide in a silent scream, jaw dislocated, lips peeled back to reveal blood-stained teeth. I fell to my knees, bile rising in my throat. This was my fault. If I'd warned her, if I tried to help instead of running. As I knelt there, overcome with guilt and horror, I caught a glimpse of my reflection in the water. What I saw made my blood run cold. My skin had taken on a sickly, gray pallor. Dark veins stood out starkly against my neck and face, pulsing with an unnatural rhythm. And my eyes, the whites had turned black, my irises a sickly yellow. I scrambled back from the water's edge, a scream building in my throat. What was happening to me? What was I becoming? Before I could process what I'd seen, I heard it. That terrible, scratching laugh echoing through the trees. Close. Too close. I lurched to my feet, panic giving me strength I didn't know I had left. I plunged back into the forest, running blindly, no thought in my head but escape. But even as I ran, a part of me knew it was futile. Whatever that creature was, whatever it had done to me, I couldn't escape it. Not really. Because now, a part of it was inside me. Growing. Changing me. And deep down, in a place I didn't want to acknowledge, I could feel a hunger awakening. A hunger that had nothing to do with food, and everything to do with the terror I'd seen in that poor hiker's dead eyes. I ran on, deeper into the shadows of the forest. But with each step, I knew I wasn't just running from the creature anymore. I was running from what I was becoming. Days blurred together as I wandered the wilderness, lost in more ways than one. The infection, or whatever it was, continued to spread. I could feel it coursing through my veins, changing me bit by bit. My reflection, caught in still pools of water or the occasional stream, became a stranger to me. My skin grew paler, almost translucent, dark veins visible beneath the surface. My fingers lengthened, the nails hardening into something more like claws. And the hunger. God, the hunger. It gnawed at me constantly, a craving for something I couldn't name but instinctively knew I shouldn't want. I avoided trails and campsites, driven by some instinct to stay away from people. Part of it was fear of what they'd do if they saw what I was becoming. But there was another part, a part that grew stronger each day, that wanted to seek them out for entirely different reasons. I subsisted on berries and whatever small animals I could catch, but it did little to satisfy the growing hunger inside me. Each night, my dreams were filled with visions of blood and terror, and each morning I woke with the taste of copper in my mouth. It was on the 7th day, or was it the 8th? Time had lost all meaning that I saw it again. The creature. My creator, my destroyer. I was huddled in the hollow of a massive old tree, shivering despite the warm summer air when I felt it. A presence, vast and alien, pressing against my mind. I looked up, and there it was, standing at the edge of the small clearing. It looked different. Or maybe I was seeing it differently. Its form seemed more solid now, less like a sketch of a nightmare and more like a terrible reality. Its limbs were still impossibly long, its body unnaturally thin. But now I could see details I missed before. Its skin was a patchwork of textures, in some places smooth and pale, in others rough and bark-like. Its hands ended in those terrible obsidian claws, but these seemed almost delicate now, like surgical instruments. And its face. God, its face. Where before there had been only a blank expanse, now there were features. Not human features, nothing so mundane. Instead, its face was a constantly shifting array of shapes and patterns, like a living kaleidoscope. The only constant was the eye's deep, black pits that seemed to draw in all light. It stood there, watching me. I waited for the panic to set in, for the desperate need to flee. But it didn't come. Instead, I felt curiosity. A desire to understand. Slowly, painfully, I crawled out of my hiding place. I stood on shaky legs, facing the creature that had destroyed my life, had turned me into whatever I was becoming. For a long moment, we just stared at each other. Then, it spoke. Not in words, not really. It was more like impressions, images, and sensations forced directly into my mind. I saw flashes of other worlds, realities so alien they made my mind recoil. I saw versions of Earth where humanity had never evolved, where other, stranger forms of life ruled. And I saw the creature moving between these realities, feeding, changing, evolving. It was a hunter, yes. But it was also an explorer, a scientist of sorts. It sought out new forms of life, new experiences. And when it found something interesting, it experimented. I was its latest experiment. As this understanding settled over me, I felt something inside me shift. The hunger that had been gnawing at me changed, focused. I knew, with a certainty that terrified me, that I needed to feed. Not on berries or rabbits, but on something far more vital. The creature must have sensed this change. It tilted its head, that kaleidoscope face swirling in what I somehow knew was approval. Then, with a motion almost too fast to follow, it pointed. East. Towards the edges of the park, towards civilization. Then it was gone, disappearing between one blink and the next, leaving me alone with my newfound hunger and terrible understanding. I stood there for a long time, wrestling with what I'd learned, with what I knew I needed to do. The part of me that was still Robert Hughes, park ranger and protector, recoiled at the thought. But that part was growing smaller by the moment, being consumed by something older, hungrier. In the end, I didn't make a conscious decision. My feet simply started moving, carrying me eastward. Towards people. Towards food. As I walked, I felt my body continuing to change. My muscles grew lean and wiry, incredibly strong. My senses sharpened. I could hear the heartbeat of a squirrel 50 feet away, could smell a hiker's sweat from a mile off. By the time I reached the edge of the park, 3 days later, the transformation was complete. I caught sight of myself in a still pool of water and barely recognized what I saw. My body was elongated, my limbs impossibly thin yet corded with muscle. My skin was a pale gray, textured like tree bark in some places. My face, it wasn't the swirling kaleidoscope of the creatures, but it was far from human. My features seemed to shift and change depending on how I looked at them, never quite settling into a recognizable form. Only my eyes remained somewhat familiar, though the whites were now black and the irises a luminous yellow. I knew I should feel horror at what I'd become, but all I felt was hunger. I smelled them before I saw them. A family, out for a late evening hike. The parents, laughing at some shared joke. 2 children, young, their high voices carrying through the trees. I moved without conscious thought, my new body gliding through the forest with impossible silence and speed. In moments, I was upon them. What happened next? I don't like to think about it. The screams, the begging, the wet sounds of tearing flesh. The taste of their fear, somehow more satisfying than even their blood. When it was over, when the hunger was finally, blessedly quiet, I looked down at what I'd done. At the broken bodies, the wide, staring eyes. And I felt nothing. No remorse, no guilt. Only a faint satisfaction, like I'd completed a particularly challenging task. That's when I knew. Robert Hughes was gone. Whatever I was now, it wasn't human. Not anymore. I turned and melted back into the forest, already feeling the hunger beginning to stir again. There would be more hikers, more campers, more food. And as I hunted, as I fed, I knew I'd be watching, waiting for someone special. Someone strong, someone interesting, someone who could become like me. A new experiment, a new evolution. The creature that had changed me was gone, moved on to other realities, other hunts. But its legacy lived on in me, and I would continue its work. So if you're reading this, if you found this journal I've left behind, consider it a warning. The thing you've heard about in campfire stories, the monster in the woods that no one really believes in, it's real, and it's hungry. And somewhere out there in the vastness of Glacier National Park, I'm waiting, watching. Maybe I'll see you on the trail someday. Maybe you'll be the next to change. My name is Donald Simmons, and I've seen things in these woods that would make your blood run cold. At 74 years old, I've spent more time among the towering pines and misty valleys of Olympic National Forest than I have in any town or city. It's in my blood, you see. My father was a ranger here, and his father before him. We're as much a part of this forest as the ancient cedars that have stood watch for centuries. October 12, 2003. That date is seared into my memory, a scar that won't fade no matter how much time passes. It was supposed to be just another day on the job, another routine search for missing campers. Instead, it became the day that shattered everything I thought I knew about the world and the creatures that inhabit it. I remember waking up that morning in my modest cabin on the outskirts of the park. The air was crisp, carrying the scent of pine and damp earth. As I sipped my coffee on the porch, watching the mist curl through the trees, I had no idea of the horrors that awaited me. No idea that by nightfall, my life would be irrevocably changed. My partner, Dale Flynn, picked me up in our battered Jeep. Dale was a good man, younger than me by a couple of decades, with a quick wit and an easy smile. We'd been working together for 5 years, and I trusted him with my life. If only I'd known how pathetic that trust would become. Morning, old-timer, Dale grinned as I climbed into the passenger seat. Ready to rescue some city slickers who can't read a compass? I grunted in response, not quite awake enough for his early morning cheer. What's the situation? Dale's expression sobered slightly. group of 5 campers. 2 couples and a single guy. They were supposed to check in at the ranger station yesterday afternoon. No show. I nodded, a faint sense of unease stirring in my gut. It wasn't uncommon for inexperienced campers to lose their way or misjudge the time it would take to hike back. But something about this felt different. Maybe it was the weather, unusually still and quiet for this time of year. Or maybe it was just the accumulated instinct of decades spent in these woods. Whatever it was, I couldn't shake the feeling that today was going to be anything but routine. As we drove deeper into the forest, the trees seemed to close in around us. The road narrowed, becoming little more than a rough track. We passed the last of the popular camping areas and entered a part of the park rarely visited by tourists. This was old-growth forest, primeval and untamed. They shouldn't have been this far out, I muttered, more to myself than to Dale. He nodded in agreement. Yeah, it's weird. Their permit was for one of the established campsites near Crescent Lake. No reason for them to come all the way out here. We fell into silence, each lost in our own thoughts. The Jeep bounced and jolted over the uneven ground, the only sound the crunch of gravel under the tires and the occasional cry of a distant bird. Finally, we reached the end of the road. From here, we'd have to continue on foot. As we gathered our gear, backpacks filled with supplies, first aid kits, and our service weapons, I couldn't shake the growing sense of dread that had settled over me like a shroud. Hey, Don, Dale said, his voice uncharacteristically serious. You got a bad feeling about this too? I met his eyes and saw my own concern mirrored there. Yeah, I admitted. Let's stick close together on this one, all right? He nodded, and together we set off into the shadowy depths of Olympic National Forest, unaware that we were walking into a nightmare that would haunt us for the rest of our lives. The forest swallowed us whole as we left the relative safety of our Jeep behind. The canopy overhead was so thick that only slivers of sunlight managed to penetrate, casting dappled shadows across the forest floor. The air was heavy with moisture, and the rich scent of decaying vegetation filled our nostrils. We moved cautiously, our eyes scanning the underbrush for any sign of the missing campers. Every so often, one of us would call out, our voices echoing unnaturally in the stillness of the forest. Hello, park rangers. Anyone out there? Only silence answered us. As we pushed deeper into the wilderness, I found myself growing increasingly uneasy. I'd spent my entire life in these woods, but something felt off. The usual background noise of the forest, the rustling of small animals, the songs of birds, was noticeably absent. It was as if the entire ecosystem was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. Dale, I whispered, not wanting to break the eerie silence too abruptly. You notice how quiet it is? He nodded, his hand unconsciously moving to rest on the butt of his pistol. Yeah, it's giving me the creeps. What do you think, Dawn? Animal activity? Maybe a big predator in the area? I shook my head slowly. I've never known even a bear or mountain lion to shut down the whole forest like this. It's like everything's hiding. We pressed on, our senses on high alert. The terrain became rougher, forcing us to climb over fallen logs and push through dense thickets of ferns and salal. After what felt like hours, we finally stumbled upon the first sign of our missing campers. It was a campsite, tucked away in a small clearing. 2 tents stood erected, their bright nylon a stark contrast to the muted greens and browns of the forest. A cold fire pit sat in the center, surrounded by camp chairs and the detritus of a hasty meal. But there was no sign of the campers themselves. What the hell? Dale muttered, moving closer to inspect one of the tents. I circled the perimeter of the camp, my eyes searching for any clue as to what might have happened. There was no sign of a struggle, no blood, no torn clothing. It was as if the 5 people had simply vanished into thin air. Dawn, come look at this, Dale called from inside one of the tents. I ducked through the entrance flap and joined him. The interior of the tent was a mess of sleeping bags and backpacks, but what caught my attention was what Dale was holding, a journal, its pages filled with hurried, almost frantic writing. "Listen to this," Dale said, his voice tight with tension. He began to read. October 10th, we're lost. Been walking for hours, but the GPS isn't working. Trees all look the same. Keep hearing strange noises at night. Not animals. At least, not any animals I've ever heard before, asterisk. He flipped to the next page. October 11th, something is watching us. We can feel it. Eyes in the darkness. Matt wants to keep moving, but we're too exhausted. Setting up camp here. God help us, asterisk. The final entry was just a single line, the handwriting so shaky it was barely legible. They're here. A chill ran down my spine as Dale finished reading. We looked at each other, the same thought mirrored in our eyes. Whatever had happened here, it was far beyond the scope of a normal search and rescue operation. We need to call this in, I said, reaching for my radio. But as I keyed the mic, all I got was static. No signal. Dale checked his own radio with the same result. Damn, he swore softly. We're on our own out here. I took a deep breath, trying to calm my racing heart. In all my years as a ranger, I never encountered anything like this. Every instinct I had was screaming at me to get out of these woods as fast as possible. But we had a job to do. 5 people were missing, and it was up to us to find them. All right, I said, my voice steadier than I felt. We need to expand our search. But we stick together, understand? No matter what happens, we don't separate. Dale nodded grimly. We exited the tent and stood in the center of the abandoned campsite, trying to decide which direction to take. That's when we heard it, a sound that made my blood run cold. It was a howl, but not like any wolf or coyote I'd ever heard. It was deeper, more guttural, with an almost human quality that sent shivers down my spine. And it was close. Too close. Dale's face had gone pale. What the hell was that? I shook my head, at a loss for words. In that moment, I knew with absolute certainty that we were in grave danger. Whatever had taken those campers was still out there. And now, it had its sights set on us. We need to move, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. Now. As we hurried away from the campsite, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. Eyes in the darkness, just like the journal had said. We were no longer the hunters. We had become the prey. We moved through the forest with a sense of urgency, our earlier caution replaced by a growing fear. The howl we'd heard seemed to echo in my mind, a constant reminder of the unknown threat that lurked in the shadows around us. Dale and I barely spoke, communicating mostly through gestures and meaningful looks. As we pushed through a particularly dense thicket, I noticed something that made me stop in my tracks. There, on the trunk of a massive Douglas fir, were 3 long, deep gouges. They started about 7 feet up the tree and ran almost to the ground. Dale, I whispered, pointing at the marks. He examined them closely, his face a mask of confusion and fear. What could have done this, Dawn? A bear? I shook my head slowly. I've never seen a bear leave marks like that. Look at the height, the depth of the gouges. Whatever did this, it's big. And it's not anything I've ever encountered in these woods before. A twig snapped somewhere in the underbrush behind us. We whirled around, hands instinctively going to our weapons. For a long moment, we stood frozen, straining our ears for any further sound. But the forest had fallen silent once again. We should keep moving, Dale said, his voice tight with tension. I nodded in agreement, and we set off once more, our pace quickening with each step. The feeling of being watched intensified, and I found myself constantly looking over my shoulder, half expecting to see some monstrous creature bearing down on us. As we crested a small rise, Dale suddenly grabbed my arm, pointing ahead. Look! Through a gap in the trees, I could see a flash of bright color, the unmistakable red of a hiker's jacket. We approached cautiously, calling out as we did so. "Hello? This is the park rangers. Are you all right?" There was no response. As we drew closer, my heart sank. The jacket was torn and bloody, hanging from a low branch like some macabre flag. Of its owner, there was no sign. Dale bent to examine the ground around the tree. "Tracks," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "But I've never seen anything like this before." I knelt beside him, studying the impressions in the soft earth. They were huge, easily twice the size of a human foot, with long, curved claw marks at the end of each toe. A chill ran down my spine as I realized these tracks matched perfectly with the gouges we'd seen on the tree earlier. "What are we dealing with here, Dawn?" Dale asked, his earlier bravado completely gone. I shook my head, at a loss for words. In all my years in these woods, I'd never encountered anything that could leave tracks like these. We were in uncharted territory, facing a threat we couldn't even begin to understand. That's when we heard it again, that bone-chilling howl, closer this time. It was answered by another, then another, the sounds coming from all around us. We were surrounded. "Run!" I yelled, all pretense of stealth forgotten. We crashed through the underbrush, branches whipping in our faces as we fled. I could hear something moving in the forest behind us, a sound of snapping branches and heavy footfalls that spurred us to even greater speed. Suddenly, the ground dropped away beneath my feet. I tumbled down a steep embankment, leaves and twigs scratching at my skin as I rolled. When I finally came to a stop, I found myself in a small clearing, dazed and disoriented. "Dale?" I called out, struggling to my feet. "Dale, where are you?" There was no answer. In the fall, we'd become separated. I was alone. A low growl from the edge of the clearing froze the blood in my veins. Slowly, I turned to face the source of the sound. There, half hidden in the shadows of the trees, stood a creature out of nightmare. It was massive, easily 7 feet tall, its body covered in thick, dark fur. But it was the face that truly terrified me, a twisted, almost human visage with a protruding jaw full of yellow teeth and small, black eyes that glinted with terrifying intelligence. For a moment, we stared at each other, predator and prey locked in a silent confrontation. Then, with a roar that shook the very air around us, it charged. I fumbled for my weapon, but my fingers felt clumsy and slow. The creature closed the distance between us with impossible speed. I saw a flash of claws, felt a searing pain across my chest, and then I was on the ground, staring up at the monster that was about to end my life. As it raised its massive paw for the killing blow, a gunshot rang out. The creature jerked back with a snarl of pain and fury. I turned my head to see Dale standing at the edge of the clearing, his rifle raised. "Get away from him, you son of a bitch!" Dale yelled, firing again. The second shot caught the creature in the shoulder. It roared in rage, then turned and bolted into the undergrowth with shocking agility for something of its size. Dale rushed to my side, his face pale with shock and fear. "Jesus, Dawn," he said, examining the deep gashes across my chest. "We've got to get you out of here." I tried to speak, but all that came out was a wet gurgle. The pain was overwhelming, and I could feel myself slipping towards unconsciousness. "Stay with me, partner," Dale urged, pressing his hand against my wounds in a futile attempt to stem the bleeding. "Help's on the way. Just hang on." But we both knew it was a lie. We were miles from any help, in a part of the forest where our radios didn't work. I was going to die here, on the damp forest floor, victim to a creature that shouldn't exist. As my vision began to fade, I heard it, the sound of something large moving through the underbrush, coming closer. Dale's head snapped up, his eyes widening in horror. "Ellis! Close your eyes. Don't look," he yelled, but it was too late. The creature burst from the trees, a blur of fur and fury. Dale tried to bring his rifle to bear, but he was too slow. The monster slammed into him with bone-crushing force, lifting him off the ground as if he weighed nothing. I watched, helpless, as the creature slammed Dale against a tree. There was a sickening crack, and Dale went limp, his eyes staring sightlessly at nothing. In that moment, something snapped inside me. Pure animal instinct took over. Ignoring the searing pain in my chest, I pushed myself up, searching desperately for anything I could use as a weapon. My hand closed around a thick branch, broken off in my fall down the embankment. It wasn't much, but it was all I had. The creature turned from Dale's lifeless body, its muzzle stained red with my partner's blood. It snarled, those terrifyingly human eyes fixed on me with predatory intensity. As it charged, I summoned every last ounce of strength I had. With an agonized grunt, I pushed myself onto one knee, raising the branch like a spear. The creature's momentum did the rest. It impaled itself on the makeshift weapon, the sharpened end punching through its chest and at its back. Its roar of triumph turned into a surprised gurgle as it collapsed beside me, twitching and choking on its own blood. For a moment, I thought it was over. But then, from deeper in the forest, I heard it, another howl, answering the first. And then another, and another. Too many to count. Panic flooded through me. I wasn't going to make it out of here alive. But some primal part of me refused to give up. With the last of my strength, I began to crawl, DRA. With the last of my strength, I began to crawl, dragging myself along the forest floor. Every movement was agony, the gashes on my chest leaving a trail of blood behind me. But I couldn't stop. I wouldn't stop. The howls were getting closer, a cacophony of inhuman voices that filled the air. I could hear the snapping of branches, the heavy footfalls of multiple creatures converging on my location. My breaths came in ragged gasps, each one sending fresh waves of pain through my body. I don't know how long I crawled. Time seemed to lose all meaning in that green hell. But suddenly, through the haze of pain and fear, I saw it, a flicker of light ahead. The trees were thinning out, and beyond them, I could make out the faint outline of a road. Hope surged through me, giving me a final burst of energy. I clawed my way forward, feeling the transition from soft earth to rough gravel under my hands. I had made it to the road, but I had nothing left. I collapsed at the edge, my vision blurring as consciousness threatened to slip away. Then, like a miracle, I heard it, the rumble of an engine, the crunch of tires on gravel. Headlights pierced the gloom, illuminating my broken body at the roadside. I tried to call out, to wave, but all I could manage was a feeble croak. The car screeched to a halt. I heard doors slam, voices raised in alarm. Oh my God! Are you okay? What happened? Hands were on me, gentle but urgent. Someone was on a phone, their voice trembling as they called for help. It's going to be all right, a woman's voice said, close to my ear. Help is on the way. I wanted to believe her. But even as blessed unconsciousness began to take me, I heard it, the rustle of leaves, the snapping of twigs. They were coming closer. With the last of my strength, I tried to warn them. Get back. I managed to gasp. In the car. Run. But it was too late. The headlights of the car illuminated the tree line, casting long, sinister shadows. And there, at the edge of the light, they appeared. Dark shapes, hunched and monstrous, their eyes glinting in the harsh glare. The people around me began to scream. I closed my eyes, not wanting to see what happened next. When I opened them again, I was in a hospital bed. The smell of antiseptic filled my nostrils, and the steady beep of monitors filled the air. For a moment, I thought it had all been a terrible nightmare. But then the pain hit me, a dull, throbbing ache across my chest where the creature's claws had torn into me. Janice, my friend from the ranger station, was sitting by my bed. There were dark circles under her eyes, and her smile trembled as she reached for my hand. They found you on the side of the road, she said, her voice thick with emotion. A couple of hikers. You were barely conscious. I tried to speak, but my throat was dry and raw. Janice brought a cup of water to my lips, helping me take small sips. Dale? I managed to croak out. Janice's eyes filled with tears. She shook her head slowly. Dale didn't make it, Ellis. I'm so sorry. The news hit me like a physical blow. Grief and guilt washed over me in a numbing wave. I closed my eyes, remembering Dale's final moments, his sacrifice that had given me the chance to escape. Over the next few days, as I drifted in and out of consciousness, I was visited by doctors, police officers, and park officials. They all wanted to know what had happened out there in the forest. I told them everything about the missing campers, the strange tracks, the monstrous creatures that had attacked us. I could see the skepticism in their eyes as I spoke. They nodded and took notes, but I could tell they didn't believe me. Trauma, they whispered when they thought I couldn't hear. Post-traumatic stress. He's blocking out what really happened. But I knew the truth. And so did the hikers who had found me, the ones who had seen the creatures emerge from the forest. But they were gone, vanished without a trace. The official reports stated that no one else had been at the scene when the ambulance arrived. I was released from the hospital a week later, my body healing but my mind still reeling from what I experienced. There was a small memorial service for Dale. I stood there, leaning heavily on a cane, as they lowered an empty casket into the ground. His body had never been found. Afterwards, I returned to my cabin, the one I'd lived in for decades. It should have felt safe, familiar. Instead, every creak of the floorboards, every rustle of wind through the trees outside, sent jolts of terror through me. The forest that had been my home for so long now felt like a lurking predator, waiting to pounce. I tried to go back to work, to regain some sense of normalcy. But it was impossible. Every time I stepped into the woods, panic would overwhelm me. I'd find myself reaching for my gun, jumping at shadows. The other rangers looked at me with pity and fear, whispering behind my back. The nightmares came every night without fail. I'd wake up screaming, drenched in sweat, the image of those monstrous eyes still burning in my mind. Sleep became a luxury I couldn't afford. That's when I started drinking. At first, it was just to help me sleep, to dull the constant fear that gnawed at my gut. But soon, it became the only way I could function at all. They let me go, of course. Said it was for the best, for everyone concerned. I didn't fight it. I barely acknowledged it. My life began to fragment, breaking apart like ice in spring thaw. I drifted from town to town, taking odd jobs when I could, never staying in one place for too long. The bottle became my constant companion, the only thing that could quiet the voices in my head, that could make me forget, even for a little while, the horrors I'd witnessed. But no matter how far I ran, no matter how much I drank, I couldn't escape. In every rustle of leaves, every shadow at dusk, I saw them. The creatures. Waiting. Watching. And part of me, the part that still remembered the ranger I used to be, the man who had faced down a monster and lived, that part of me waited too. For the day when the bottle wouldn't be enough. For the day when I'd finally gather the courage to go back into those woods and face my demons once and for all. Because I know they're still out there. In the deep, dark places of the forest where humans rarely tread. And someday, someone else will stumble upon them. Someone else will have to face the terror I faced. So I wait. And I remember. And I pray that when the time comes, I'll be ready. Ready to finish what started on that terrible day in Olympic National Forest. Ready to ensure that Dale's sacrifice wasn't in vain. Because in the end, that's all I have left. A mission. A purpose. A reason to keep going, keep fighting, even when every instinct screams at me to give up. The creatures are out there. And someday, somehow, I'll make sure the world knows the truth. But until then, I'll keep moving, keep running, keep hiding from the shadows that haunt my every waking moment. And in the dark of night, when the wind howls through the trees and the moon casts long shadows across the land, I'll raise my bottle in a silent toast. To Dale, to the people we couldn't save, and to the hope that someday the nightmare will finally end. But deep down, I know the truth. In this story, there are no happy endings, only survivors. And the knowledge that out there, in the deepest, darkest parts of the wilderness, monsters still roam. Real monsters. Waiting. Watching. Hungry. And sooner or later, they'll be coming for us all. My name is Frank Morgan, and I am 68 years old. What I'm about to tell you happened to me on October 17, 2014, deep in the heart of the Great Smoky Mountains National Park. It's a tale that's haunted me ever since, one that's changed the course of my life and shaken everything I thought I knew about the world around us. I've been working these woods my whole life, just like my poppy before me. The Morgan family has been a fixture in these parts for generations, our roots as deep as the ancient trees that blanket these misty hills. I knew them trails like the back of my hand, or at least I thought I did. Figured after all these years, nothing could surprise me anymore. Guess I was wrong about that. It was a crisp autumn morning when I got the call. Sally, the dispatcher down at Ranger Station, her voice tight with worry. Frank? We've got a situation. 2 college kids, weekend camping trip. They've gone off the grid. Now, folks get lost up in these mountains all the time. Usually, it's nothing more than a case of city slickers underestimating the terrain, wandering off trail and ending up turned around. But something in Sally's tone set me on edge. What's different about this one, Sal? I asked, already reaching for my boots. It's been 3 days, Frank. No sign of their gear, no sign of them at all. Not a trace. Search teams have combed the lower elevations. Nothing. That set off alarm bells. In my experience, even the most inexperienced hikers leave some kind of trail. A dropped water bottle, a scrap of clothing caught on a branch. Something. Any chance they just packed up and left? Decided to extend their trip without telling anyone? Sally's sigh crackled over the line. Their car's still at the trailhead. Frank, there's something else. A couple of hikers reported hearing strange noises up in the high country. Said it didn't sound like any animal they recognized. My mind started racing. Was some drifter or escape con hiding out up there, preying on the unwary? It wouldn't be the first time these mountains harbor dangerous fugitives. But my gut told me this was something different. All right, Sal. I'm heading in. Put together a team, seasoned folks only. We're going up into the higher elevations where they were last seen. Already on it. They'll meet you at the North Creek trailhead in an hour. Frank, be careful out there. I hung up, a chill running down my spine that had nothing to do with the autumn air. As I gathered my gear, my eyes fell on the old shotgun mounted above the fireplace. After a moment's hesitation, I took it down, checking the action. Better to have it and not need it, I told myself. Little did I know, I need every weapon I could get my hands on before this was over. The team assembled at the trailhead was a mix of seasoned park rangers and local search and rescue volunteers. I recognized most of them. These mountains were a small community, after all. There was Tom Hawkins, a strapping young ranger in his early 30s, eager and full of energy. Beth Cooper, one of our most experienced trackers, her weathered face set in grim determination. Jensen McBride, a local hunter who knew these hills almost as well as I did. We went in packing heavy, rifles, emergency supplies, the works. This wasn't some casual hike to find a couple of lost Boy Scouts. The mood was tense as we set off, the weight of our mission hanging over us like the low-lying clouds that cloaked the mountain tops. The first few miles were uneventful, our boots crunching through fallen leaves as we ascended into the higher elevations. But as we climbed, the forest around us seemed to change. The familiar trails took on an alien quality, the trees pressing in closer, their branches reaching out like gnarled fingers. "Frank," Beth called out, her voice hushed. "Take a look at this." She was crouched by a thicket of rhododendron, examining something on the ground. As I approached, I saw what had caught her attention, a set of tracks unlike anything I'd seen before. They were huge, easily twice the size of a bear print, with strange elongated toes and deep claw marks. "What do you make of it?" Tom asked, his hand unconsciously moving to rest on his holstered sidearm. I shook my head, a cold feeling settling in my gut. "I don't rightly know. But whatever made these, it's big. And it's not supposed to be here." We pressed on, the mood growing more somber with each passing hour. The woods felt heavy, the air thick even for autumn. It was as if the very forest was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. As dusk approached, we made camp in a narrow valley, intending to continue the search at daybreak. After a meager dinner of trail rations, I decided to take a perimeter walk. Old ranger habits die hard, and something about this place had me on edge. I strayed a little ways from the firelight, just scanning the tree line. That's when I heard it. A rustling sound, then a low, guttural growl that made the hair on the back of my neck stand on end. It wasn't any animal I recognized, too deep for a cougar, too guttural for a bear. Back at camp, everyone was asleep. It was probably nothing, I told myself. Probably some half-starved coyote. Yet I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, of hostile eyes tracking my every move from the impenetrable darkness beyond our little circle of light. I spent the rest of the night listening to the symphony of crickets, punctuated by the occasional snap of a branch, the hoot of an owl, and something else, something that sounded far too big, far too close for comfort. The next morning broke cold and clear, a layer of frost coating the ground and a thin mist rising from the valley floor. As we broke camp, I could see the strain of the night's unease etched on everyone's faces. No one had slept well, it seemed. We began our search again, spreading out to cover more ground. Hours passed without a sign of the missing campers. I found myself gravitating to the areas most overgrown, the tangled thickets of rhododendron and mountain laurel. Something told me these kids hadn't wandered far from where they began. By midday, Tom and Beth were getting jumpy. They'd heard those noises too, swore they saw shadows just out of sight. It wasn't their imaginations, I'd seen them too. Dark shapes flitting between the trees, always at the edge of vision, gone when you tried to focus on them. "Frank," Jensen called out, his voice tight. "You need to see this." We gathered around a small clearing. The ground was torn up, deep furrows gouged into the earth. Scattered around were scraps of fabric, a torn backpack, shreds of what might have been a tent. And blood. Not much, but enough to know something violent had happened here. "Jesus," Tom whispered. "What could have done this?" Before I could answer, a scream split the air. It came from the direction Beth had wandered off in. We took off running, crashing through the underbrush, hearts pounding. We found Beth backed up against a massive oak, her face pale as a sheet. She pointed with a trembling hand to a gap in the foliage. There, half hidden by shadows, was something. For a moment, my mind went blank, unable to process what I was seeing. This thing was a nightmare made flesh, standing at least 9 feet tall, caked in mud and who knows what else. It was impossibly strong looking, muscles rippling beneath a coat of thick black fur. The head was hard to describe. Small and hunched forward, with a flat, protruding snout and tiny black eyes full of predatory cunning. It roared, baring rows of vicious teeth, and that's when the smell hit me. Like rotting meat and something altogether fouler, a stench that made my eyes water and my stomach heave. "Fall back," I shouted, raising my rifle and firing off warning shots. The thing flinched, then charged forward, its speed terrifying for something so large. We fell back in disarray, firing as we went. The creature barreled forward, heedless of the gunfire. It lunged at Beth, its clawed hand the size of a bear trap raking across her torso. She screamed, then crumpled to the ground. Chaos erupted. Shots rang out and the creature let out an enraged roar. I saw it grab Tom, tossing him aside like a broken doll. Then, as suddenly as it had materialized, it was gone, vanishing into the undergrowth with impossible agility for its size. I sprinted to Beth, the world blurring around me. Blood soaked through my hands as I tried to stop the bleeding. Her eyes stared lifelessly up at the sky, unseeing. Tom's fate wasn't much better. He lay sprawled against a tree, legs mangled, neck twisted at an unnatural angle. Only Jensen had escaped unscathed, his face pale with shock. The three of us were all that remained of the search party, left staring at the mangled remains of our comrades. The creature had moved off, but it could be anywhere, watching us, stalking, waiting. We radioed for backup, our voices trembling. But who the hell would believe us? Ranger deaths, sure. Animal attack, maybe. But a hulking, unidentified monster that shrugged off gunfire like it was nothing? We'd be lucky if they didn't ship us off to the psych ward. Backup came, of course. Armed support, even a chopper circling overhead. But what they didn't find was the creature. They found the bodies, the campsite ransacked, and the remnants of an animal carcass nearby, torn to bloody ribbons. They also found footprints, huge prints unlike anything in the official wildlife guides. The official report went with mountain lion attack. Easier to swallow, I suppose. Easier to avoid the media frenzy and uncomfortable questions about what else might be lurking out there in the dark corners of the wilderness. It didn't bring back Beth or Tom, didn't change the fact that whatever we encountered that day wasn't natural, wasn't simply part of the ecosystem we thought we understood. They told me to take leave, said I was suffering from shock, trauma. Maybe they were right, but I couldn't sit still, couldn't forget the creature's malevolent glare, the sickening reek of its fur. Couldn't forget Beth's last terrified scream or the way Tom's body had been tossed aside like a rag doll. I left the mountains for a while, drifted, did odd jobs. But the nightmares followed me. I'd wake up in a cold sweat, the creature's roar echoing in my ears, the stench of its fur burning my nostrils. I tried to drown it out, with whiskey, with work, with anything I could find. Nothing helped. Months passed. I was a shell of my former self, haunted by what I'd seen, by the knowledge that something was out there, something that defied explanation. And then, one day, I saw it. A small article, buried in the back pages of a local paper. Another disappearance, another search party baffled. This time in the Ozarks. It was like a spark igniting in my brain. I knew, deep in my bones, that it was connected. That whatever had killed Beth and Tom wasn't an isolated incident. It was happening again. That's when I made my decision. I couldn't go back to my old life, couldn't pretend that the world was the same place I'd always thought it was. But I could do something. I could hunt this thing, could try to stop it from happening to anyone else. I'm back in the game now, not working as a ranger anymore, at least not officially. I patrol different wilderness areas, the sprawling forests and swamplands, chasing rumors of hunters disappearing, hikers vanishing without a trace. I leave notes, warnings for those brave enough or foolish enough to venture into the deepest parts of the backcountry. Beware, predator at large. Someone has to do it. Someone has to stand between the innocent and the things that lurk in the shadows. It's a lonely existence, a thankless one. And one of these days, that creature or one of its kin will find me again. I know that. But until then, I'll keep searching, keep warning. Because it's an ugly world sometimes, but even the ugliest truths need to be brought to light. My pursuit became an obsession, consuming every waking moment. I'd spot a story in the local papers, an unexplained disappearance in some remote corner of the country, and I'd be on the road before the ink was dry. Each new location offered a twisted puzzle, tracks defying identification, half-eaten animal carcasses with tooth marks no known predator could have made, the lingering whispers of terrified witnesses who glimpsed something they couldn't quite explain. I'd camp alone in the woods for weeks at a time, my senses always on high alert, waiting for the slightest hint of movement, the faintest whiff of that putrid musk in the air. Sometimes, in the dead of night, I'd hear that bone-chilling roar echoing across distant ridgelines. It was out there, always just one step ahead of me. I started keeping even more detailed records. I meticulously cataloged each encounter, each footprint or shredded campsite. I cross-referenced the sightings, mapped likely hunting ranges. Slowly, patterns began to emerge. These creatures, whatever they were, weren't random in their movements. There was intelligence behind their actions, a chilling method to their savagery. They showed a clear preference for dense, old-growth forest, areas where the canopy blotted out the sun and the underbrush grew thick and tangled. They seemed to stick to the fringes of civilization, places where the encroachment of human development butted up against true wilderness. And they were adapting, learning. With each passing year, they grew bolder, venturing closer to populated areas, their attacks becoming more frequent and more brazen. The obsession came at a cost. What few relationships I had left unraveled. Anyone who stuck around long enough saw the haunted look in my eyes, the way I'd jump at every creaking floorboard or rustle of leaves. My savings dwindled, replaced by a collection of worn trail boots, battered binoculars, and a shotgun that rarely left my side. But it didn't matter. This was bigger than any one person, bigger than my own comfort or safety. I was on the trail of something that threatened the very fabric of what we thought we knew about the natural world. And I couldn't let it go, not until I had answers. One trail led me north, way up into the isolated forests along the U.S.-Canadian border. The locals spoke in hushed tones of something stalking the woods, of livestock vanishing and hunters going missing. I knew I was close. It was there I met Hank, a wiry, weathered old trapper who'd spent his entire life in these parts. At first, he was skeptical of my wild tales, but there was something in his eyes, a flicker of recognition, of fear, that told me he'd seen things too, things he couldn't explain. Over a bottle of whiskey one night, the story came spilling out. Hank swore he'd seen something monstrous up on the ridgeline above his cabin, something that snatched one of his traps clean off its chain. A trap that could hold a grizzly. "Weren't no bear," Hank muttered, his gnarled hands clutching his glass. "Weren't nothing natural at all. Had eyes that glowed in the dark, I tell you. Smart, too. Like it knew I was watching." We spent the next week up in those woods, laying out extra traps, setting up trail cameras, waiting for the creature to return. The forest felt different up here, older, wilder. The trees grew close together, their branches intertwining to create a canopy so thick that even at midday, the forest floor was cloaked in perpetual twilight. It returned on the fourth night. I woke to Hank's panicked shouts and the staccato burst of gunfire ripping through the darkness. I scrambled out of my tent, sleep-fogged and disoriented, fumbling for my rifle. The clearing in front of Hank's cabin was a scene of utter chaos. Hank was slumped against the porch, already gone, his chest ripped open by monstrous claws. One of the creatures, the same massive brute I remembered from the Smokies, stood over his body, blood dripping from its fangs. It turned, pinning me in the glare of those beady, malevolent eyes. But it wasn't alone. A younger, smaller creature flanked it, its fur dappled with Hank's fresh blood. My blood ran cold as the realization hit me. They were breeding, expanding their numbers. Rage and grief ignited within me. This was personal now. Hank had been a friend, one of the few who believed me, who understood the gravity of what we were facing. I raised my rifle and fired, a desperate act of defiance against these nightmares made flesh. The bigger creature snarled, swiping a massive paw in my direction. I dove for cover, rolling behind the remains of Hank's woodshed. Splinters flew as the creature demolished the structure with brute force. I was pinned down, heart pounding like a war drum in my chest. Another gunshot rang out, and the younger creature cried out in pain. I risked a glance and saw it limping away into the trees, a streak of red trailing behind. One down, at least, but the larger one, the real threat, was still focused on ripping me to shreds. Just when I thought it was over, hope flared. A vehicle roared up the dirt path leading to the cabin, headlights cutting through the darkness. Two figures leaped out, armed to the teeth. They shouted that they were here to help, that they'd heard the commotion. For a fleeting second, I believed salvation had arrived. But something was wrong. Their movements were jerky, awkward, their expressions fixed in a way that seemed off. Then I noticed their eyes, gleaming in the moonlight. Those same small, black, unnaturally intelligent eyes I'd seen in the creatures. Horror washed over me as I realized the truth. These weren't rescuers. They were more of those things, wearing human skin like a grotesque disguise. They'd evolved, adapted, found a way to hide in plain sight. I opened my mouth to shout a warning, but it was too late. The two newcomers turned their guns on me. The first shot slammed into my shoulder, sending me sprawling. Pain exploded through my body as I hit the ground hard. The hulking creature was closing in, sensing my vulnerability, relishing the kill. This was it. After all those years, all those solitary miles, it would end not with a hero's stand, but a desperate demise in this remote, blood-soaked clearing. Then, as if called from a nightmare, a new sound split the air. It started as a low rumble, rising to a deep, ground-shaking roar that seemed to come from everywhere at once. The creatures, including the one closing in on me, froze, confusion replacing their bloodlust. From the shadows emerged a bear. But not just any bear. This was a behemoth easily twice the size of the largest grizzly I'd ever seen. Its broad chest heaved with each breath, claws the length of machetes glinting in the moonlight. But it was the eyes that truly chilled me, blazing with not just animal fury, but a chilling, primal intelligence. It charged the creatures with another ear-splitting roar, moving with a speed that belied its massive size. The bear was a blur of fur and teeth, its attacks precise and devastating. One of the disguised creatures barely had time to raise its gun before the bear ripped it apart in a spray of blood and gore. The other fled, scrambling for its truck in blind panic. The monstrous creature that had stalked me, the killer of Beth and Tom and now Hank, hesitated for a moment. Then, driven by some primal instinct, it turned to face this new threat. What followed was a clash of titans, a battle that shook the very earth beneath my feet. The two monsters tore into each other with a savagery that defied description. Trees splintered under the force of their blows, the clearing echoing with roars of pain and fury. I scrambled to my feet, my wounded shoulder screaming in protest, and watched in awe as nature itself seemed to rebel against the aberration that had invaded it. The newcomer's truck sputtered to life, its tires spinning as it disappeared down the dirt track. I fumbled with my rifle, but the fight raged beyond my ability to intervene. This was their battle now, forces of nature beyond human comprehension. In the end, it was over almost as quickly as it had begun. The creature, for all its terrifying strength, lay crumpled on the blood-soaked ground. The giant bear stood above it, breathing heavily, a fresh gash across its flank the only sign of the ferocious fight. It turned its massive head and looked directly at me. In that moment, I felt a surge of understanding wash over me. This bear, this impossibly large protector of the wilds, was connected to those creatures in some way I couldn't fully grasp. It was part of some ancient balance, a guardian of the old ways rising to meet a threat to the natural order. The bear lumbered away, disappearing back into the trees with the same eerie silence with which it had appeared. I stood there, shaking, my world tilted on its axis. As dawn spilled over the clearing, I saw the damage in stark light, Hank's lifeless form, the monstrous corpses, some still unsettlingly human-like, the remnants of a battle that defied understanding. The aftermath is a blur in my memory. I made the call, gave a report filled with half-truths and evasions. Bear attack, I said. Unknown assailants. More lies to cover up a truth too dangerous, too paradigm-shattering to tell. They came, of course. Rangers, police, even some men in dark suits who never gave their names. They buried Hank and cleaned up the clearing, sanitizing the scene into something explainable, something easy to forget. But I knew the truth, and it weighed on me like a physical thing. In the days and weeks that followed, I pored over my notes, connecting dots I'd never seen before. The creatures, the bear, they were all part of something bigger, something older than humanity itself. A hidden world existing alongside our own, occasionally bleeding through in ways we couldn't comprehend. I continued to wander, following the trail of blood and whispers. But that battle up north changed me. Now, I'm not just a hunter, but a witness to a hidden world, a keeper of secrets too dangerous for the public to know. My quest isn't about killing those creatures anymore. It's about learning, about understanding the forces that play out there in the dark places of the world. And maybe, just maybe, finding a way for all of us, human and other, to survive together in this world that's far stranger and more terrifying than we ever imagined. I've seen things that would shatter most people's sanity. I've faced monsters both inhuman and all too human. But I've also glimpsed wonders beyond description, caught fleeting visions of a world far more complex and beautiful than we realize. So I keep moving, keep searching. Because someone needs to stand watch, to be the sentinel between two worlds. And if that someone has to be a broken down old ranger with too many miles on his boots and too many ghosts in his past, well, so be it. The wilderness is vast, and night is falling. There's work to be done.